The sun rose slow and red over the jagged rim of Apache Valley, lighting the desert in streaks of copper and gold. Morning came like fire to the land, a hard, beautiful light that left no shadow unjudged. Out here, where the wind smelled of sage and stone, people said that every rock carried a story, and some of those stories were better left unspoken. The town of Redemption crouched on the valley's edge like a guilty conscience. It was a huddle of clapboard buildings, dust-choked and God-fearing, built by men who wanted to leave their sins behind and women who hoped to civilize them. The church's white steeple was the tallest thing for 50 miles, and Reverend Josiah Whitfield made sure everyone knew it. His sermons rang out every Sunday morning, warning his flock about temptation, wickedness, and the dangers of the wild country beyond the ridge. But beyond that ridge was Apache Valley, a place the townspeople pretended not to see. They said the valley was cursed, that it belonged to spirits who walked like men, that sometimes in the dead of night, the earth itself trembled beneath the footfall of something huge and unseen. A few travelers claimed to have glimpsed a shadow moving among the mesas, taller than any man, broad as 2 horses. They called him the Giant of Apache Valley, a ghost warrior from some ancient war who guarded his land against trespassers. No one could prove the story true, but no one dared disprove it either. Only one soul in Redemption looked at the valley with something other than fear: the preacher's daughter, Clara Whitfield. She was 18 that spring, with sunlight hair and a mind as restless as the wind that chased tumbleweeds down Main Street. Every morning she stood at the parsonage window, staring at the far blue outline of the mountains, wondering what secrets they held. While her father thundered about sin and salvation, she dreamed of wide skies, of freedom, of hearing her own voice echo against the canyon walls. To Clara, the valley wasn't cursed. It was calling. Her mother had died when she was 12, leaving her alone with her father's discipline and the expectations of the congregation. She played the organ on Sundays, baked for church socials, and spoke softly so as not to invite gossip. Yet sometimes she would walk past the edge of town to the ridge where the land fell away into the valley below. From there she could see the long ribbon of the river, the stands of cottonwood glimmering like coins, and the red cliffs carved into strange shapes by centuries of wind. It felt alive, as if the earth itself was breathing. Old Mrs. Crenshaw, the midwife, once told her, "That valley's got a heart. You can hear it if you listen close enough." Clara believed her. Still, the tales of the giant lingered. Some said he was the last of his tribe, left behind when the others were driven away. Others swore he was no man at all but a spirit who punished greed and pride. The cowhands whispered that he could lift a bull with one arm, that his eyes glowed like embers. Children dared each other to walk past the old stone marker at the ridge, but none went farther. For Clara, the giant was a mystery. Frightening, yes, but fascinating too. She often wondered whether he was real or just a legend the grown-ups used to keep their fears in line. And if he was real, what kind of man chose to live alone in such a desolate, holy place? That spring, the valley bloomed after a season of hard rain. Wildflowers burst from the clay, and the air shimmered with heat and the hum of bees. One morning, Clara saw something move far below the ridge, a dark figure against the silver river. For a moment, it seemed to rise taller than a man, then vanish behind the cottonwoods. She blinked, uncertain. It could have been a trick of light. Or it could have been the beginning of the story the whole town had spent years pretending not to tell. She didn't speak of it to her father. Reverend Whitfield had no patience for superstition. "The valley is wilderness," he told her once, "and wilderness is temptation. The Lord made man to cultivate, not to wander." But as Clara watched the horizon burn gold with sunset, she felt something awaken in her, a question she could no longer ignore. If the valley held a secret, she meant to learn it. And somewhere beneath those red cliffs, a pair of watchful eyes had already seen her, eyes that would change her life forever. The bells of redemption rang sharp and clear across the morning, calling the faithful to prayer. Clara Whitfield walked beside her father along the dusty street, her hands folded neatly before her, her bonnet tied tight under her chin. The townsfolk nodded as she passed, the blacksmith tipping his hat, Mrs. Crenshaw waving a flower-covered hand from her porch, all of them greeting her not so much as Clara, but as the preacher's daughter. That title carried weight. It meant she was to be watched, judged, admired from afar but never truly known. People spoke of her goodness as if it were a hymn she'd written herself. But Clara often felt it was more like a song she'd been forced to sing since birth. Inside the church, sunlight slanted through the tall windows, casting colored ribbons over the pews. Reverend Whitfield climbed into the pulpit with his worn Bible, his voice strong and unyielding as the desert wind. He preached of order, obedience, and the dangers of pride, the kind of pride, he said, that made a person think they could stand alone, without the Lord's guiding hand. The congregation murmured amen in rhythm with his every pause. Clara played the organ as he spoke, her fingers light on the keys, her eyes drifting toward the open doorway where she could just glimpse the hills in the distance. The tune was familiar, Rock of Ages, but she let her mind wander beyond the notes, beyond the sermon, beyond redemption itself. She wondered if anyone, anywhere, ever looked at those same hills and saw promise instead of peril. Her father finished his sermon with a thunderous, "Let the wicked flee," and the congregation rose like a single breath. Clara followed, offering polite smiles, soft words, and the gentle composure expected of her. The women whispered kind things. "Such a blessing to your father. The Lord shines through you, dear." The men, more awkward in their praise, nodded respectfully, but kept their distance. All except one. Sheriff Elijah Gaines was waiting outside, tall and broad-shouldered, his silver badge catching the sun. He had a reputation for fairness, though some said he was more interested in the preacher's approval than in enforcing the law. He tipped his hat to Clara with a practiced grin. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "fine sermon today. Your father surely speaks with the Almighty's own authority." Clara smiled because that was what she was supposed to do. "Yes, Sheriff. Father's words are strong." "Strong indeed," he said, his eyes flicking toward her father before settling back on her. "You'll be joining us at the town picnic next Sunday, won't you? Folks would be mighty disappointed if you didn't." "I'll come if Father permits it," she answered carefully. "He likes to keep the Sabbath quiet," the sheriff chuckled. "Quiet's not a word most folks use for our gatherings. But I reckon if anyone could bring grace to the place, it'd be you." Clara blushed slightly and lowered her gaze. Compliments, however mild, always felt like stepping onto unsteady ground. "You're kind, Sheriff. I'll ask Father." When she looked up again, he'd already tipped his hat and strode off down the street. Her father joined her a moment later, his face stern. "Elijah Gaines means well," Reverend Whitfield said, "but he's too fond of worldly company. Be polite, but don't encourage him." "Yes, Father," she replied. That was the answer she gave to nearly every instruction. "Yes, Father." It was safer that way. That evening, as the sun dipped below the mesas, Clara sat by the parsonage window again. The hymnal lay open in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. The light outside turned the valley red and gold, and somewhere beyond that glow lay the wild country she longed to see. She imagined the wind running through her hair, imagined the sound of the river instead of the church bell, imagined a life not bound by propriety and whispered expectation. From the kitchen came the sound of her father's low voice, reciting scripture as he prepared his notes for the next sermon. His words were steady and sure, carved from conviction. The same conviction that had built this town, this home, this narrow world she lived in. Clara loved him, but she also pitied him. He had built walls of righteousness so high that even grace could barely reach over them. When the last light faded from the sky, she stood and looked toward the valley once more. For just a heartbeat, she thought she saw movement, a faint glimmer near the cottonwoods far below. She pressed a hand to the glass. Nothing stirred. Only the night wind answered. Still, the feeling lingered, that someone or something was watching her, not with malice, but with a strange, wordless curiosity. And though she couldn't have said why, the thought didn't frighten her at all. The wind had been restless all afternoon, one of those uneasy desert winds that carried dust and foreboding in equal measure. The sky darkened early, clouds piling up like bruises above the ridge. By sundown, the first rolls of thunder were already echoing down the valley. Clara stood on the porch, watching the heavens gather their wrath. The air was electric, the smell of rain sharp as iron. Her father, never fond of storms, had already shuttered the windows and gone to his study, muttering prayers against nature's tempests. But Clara lingered. She loved storms. They made the world honest. No sermon, no law, no proper word could tame thunder. The first drops fell, heavy, hot, and sudden. Within moments, the rain came in sheets, drumming on the roof, splashing against the parsonage steps. Lightning split the sky, white and wild, illuminating the valley in ghostly flashes. She was about to retreat indoors when she heard it, a strange sound beneath the roar of rain. A crash. Then the startled cry of one of their horses. Without thinking, Clara snatched her cloak and ran for the barn. The door banged open against the wind. Inside, the animals stamped and snorted, frightened by the storm. Lantern light flickered weakly, throwing long, trembling shadows across the walls. That was when she saw him. A man lay collapsed near the hay pile, or rather, something larger than any man she'd ever seen. He was motionless except for the rise and fall of his chest. His skin was dark bronze, his hair black as pitch and soaked through with rain. Blood stained his shoulder where an arrow had broken off. The shaft snapped close to the flesh. Clara froze. Her breath caught between fear and awe. He was enormous, broad through the chest and shoulders, built like a figure carved from the canyon itself. Yet his face, when she stepped closer, was peaceful in an almost noble way. There was no hatred there, only exhaustion. She glanced toward the house, then back at him. Her father would never allow an Apache, much less a wounded one, under his roof. But leaving him out in the storm was unthinkable. Clara fetched a clean cloth, water, and a lantern, her hands trembling as she knelt beside him. The wound looked fresh, likely from an ambush. Carefully, she cleaned the blood away and snapped the broken arrow shaft, pulling it free with a gasp. The man stirred, a low sound escaping his lips. Something that might have been a word, though she didn't understand it. "Shh," she whispered. "You're safe. Just rest." He blinked once, eyes flickering open. They were dark and deep, like the valley at night, eyes that had seen more than she could imagine. For an instant, their gazes locked, and she felt a jolt run through her, not of fear but recognition. Then he slipped back into unconsciousness. She worked quickly, binding the wound with strips torn from her petticoat. The rain hammered on, muffling every sound. When she finally sat back, breathless and shaking, she realized what she had done. She had hidden a wounded Apache warrior in her father's barn. Outside, the thunder rolled again. Louder, closer. The night stretched on, long and sleepless. Clara kept watch beside him, changing the cloth on his shoulder when it grew dark with blood. Every so often she thought she heard movement outside. A horse, a voice, something searching. She dimmed the lantern and pressed a hand to her heart, praying the storm would hide them both. At last, near dawn, the thunder drifted away into silence. The air smelled clean and raw, as though the world had been washed and made new. The man stirred again. His eyes opened fully this time, sharp and aware. He tensed, muscles coiling as if ready to fight. Clara raised her hands quickly. "It's all right," she said softly. "You're hurt. I only helped." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his English rough but clear. "You are Preacher's daughter." She blinked, startled. "How do you know that?" A faint, wry smile touched his lips. "Everyone in this valley knows Preacher's daughter." Before she could answer, he closed his eyes again, his strength spent. Clara sat there in the pale morning light, heart racing, realizing that her quiet world had just changed forever. The storm had passed, but another, far greater one was about to begin. The morning after the storm dawned quiet and strange. A low mist clung to the valley, and the church bell rang faintly through the damp air, calling the faithful to thank the Lord for sparing them the night's fury. But Clara Whitfield could not join them. Her thoughts, and her conscience, were tied to the wounded man lying in the hayloft. She waited until her father left for the church, Bible in hand, coat buttoned tight against the morning chill. When she saw his figure disappear down the road, she slipped out the back door, carrying a basin of water, a loaf of bread, and a prayer she didn't know how to name. The barn smelled of rain and horses and iron. The giant was still there, breathing steadily now, though his skin gleamed with fever. His wound had bled through the bandage, the cloth stained deep crimson. Clara knelt beside him, trying not to notice how large his hand looked against the straw, how broad his shoulders were even at rest. When she touched his forehead, the heat startled her. "You'll burn up if I don't keep this clean," she murmured. She rewrapped the wound with clean linen, working carefully, her hands steady despite the hammering of her heart. Every motion felt forbidden, not just tending to an injured stranger, but tending to him. the man the town whispered about in fearful tones. The supposed giant of Apache Valley. But as she looked at his face, the hard lines softened by exhaustion, she could not see a monster. Only a man who had suffered too much and trusted too few. After a long silence, his voice came, low, rough, but no longer weak. "You shouldn't be here." Clara startled, nearly dropping the bandage. His eyes were open now, steady and unreadable. I brought food," she said quickly, "and clean water. I need to leave," he interrupted. His tone was quiet, but it carried weight. "If your people find me, they will finish what others started." "You can't go anywhere," she said, a little more firmly than she intended. "You'd collapse before you reach the ridge. You'll stay here until you're strong enough." He studied her for a long moment as if measuring her conviction. Then slowly he nodded. "You have a brave heart, preacher's daughter." Maybe too brave, she almost smiled. "My father would call it stubborn." The faintest flicker of amusement passed through his eyes. Then he closed them again, as if even that small exchange had drained what little strength he had left. When he slept, Clara examined the arrowhead she had pulled from his shoulder the night before. It was unlike any she'd seen, finely made with markings carved along the shaft. Whoever had fired it, it wasn't a hunting arrow. It was meant to kill. Hours passed. She fed him bits of bread soaked in broth, urged him to drink. His fever broke by evening, leaving him pale but awake. When he asked for her name, she hesitated, not because she didn't trust him, but because speaking it aloud somehow made everything between them real. "Clara," she said finally. He nodded. "I am called Taza." The name fit him, and strong, simple, ancient. "Were you attacked?" she asked softly. "Was it soldiers?" His eyes darkened. "Men from the hills, bandits, they kill for gold or drink. They wear white men's coats, but no honor." "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. Taza looked away. "Do not be. You did not shoot the arrow." Still, guilt crept through her. People like her father had always spoken of the Apaches as savages, heathens, enemies of the righteous. But here before her was a man who spoke with quiet dignity, who had thanked her without pride. Perhaps the savagery was not his to bear. Before she left the barn, she gave him her father's old coat and covered him with a blanket. "I'll bring more food tomorrow," she said. "No one will know," he frowned faintly. "You risk much." "Maybe," she said, standing in the doorway, the fading light framing her in gold. "But maybe it's time someone did." As she turned back toward the parsonage, Clara felt the weight of what she had chosen, a secret too large to confess, and a truth too dangerous to deny. Behind her in the dim barn, Taza watched her go. His breath came slow and even, but his mind was alert. He had seen courage before, in warriors and mothers defending children and the old who refused to flee. But this girl's courage was something different, quiet, pure, and utterly disarming. He closed his eyes, listening to her footsteps fade. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone. By the next Sunday, the sun had burned the land back to dust. The rain was only a memory, and the desert wind had returned to its usual business, stirring secrets where they didn't belong. In redemption, secrets never stayed quiet for long. Clara had been sneaking to the barn each morning before sunrise and again at dusk. Taza's strength was returning. He could sit upright now, though his movements were slow and measured like a bear testing a healed wound. He said little, but his silence was never cold. When he did speak, it was with thought. A word here, a question there. He had asked her once, "Why do you help me when your people would rather see me dead?" She hadn't known how to answer. "Because," she'd said finally, "you're hurt, and because no one else would." Now, a week later, Clara walked through town with a basket on her arm and unease in her chest. The air felt different, heavier. People turned their heads as she passed, not unusual, but today their smiles seemed sharper. Mrs. Crenshaw, the midwife, called out from her porch, "Clara, dear, you tell your father I've got fresh herbs if he needs them for his headaches. And mind you don't wander past the ridge. They say someone's been prowling about down there." Clara's heart gave a small, startled jump. "Prowling?" "Mm-hmm." Mrs. Crenshaw lowered her voice. "Hank Lester swears he saw tracks out near his pasture. Big ones. Thought maybe a bear. But there ain't been bears here in years. Sheriff's rounding up a few men to look into it." Clara forced a polite smile. "I'll be careful, ma'am." She walked on, the sound of her heartbeat drowning out her footsteps. Big tracks, the kind that could belong to a man as large as Taza. That night, after her father had retired with his Bible and lamp, she slipped into the barn again. The moonlight spilled through the cracks in the boards, striping the hay with silver. Taza was awake, sharpening a broken knife against a stone. His shoulder was still wrapped, but the worst of the wound had closed. "They are looking for you," she said quietly. He stopped sharpening. "Who?" "The sheriff. Men from town. They found your tracks." He gave a slow nod, neither surprised nor afraid. "They always come sooner or later." Clara bit her lip. "You can't stay here much longer." "If they find you, they will hang me," he finished simply. Then softer. "And you will suffer for helping." Her throat tightened. "I don't care about that." "You should." For a long moment they just looked at each other. Two people from opposite worlds, caught in a silence that said more than words could manage. The lantern light flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him seem both fierce and human. Clara saw the faint scars on his hands, the deep weariness behind his eyes. Whatever he had lived through had shaped him into something unbreakable. He broke the silence first. "I will go before dawn. The mountains are close. I can travel by the river. You're not strong enough." "I am strong enough to die on my feet," he said, with a quiet finality that frightened her more than any threat could. "Better that than bring trouble to you." She shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. "You won't die." "Not if I can help it." For the first time, Taza smiled, a small, real smile that softened his whole face. "You speak like someone who has never lost. I speak like someone who still hopes." He turned back to the knife, testing the edge. "Hope is dangerous. So is fear," she said. Outside, a horse whinnied, distant but approaching. They both froze. Then came the faint jingle of spurs and men's voices, muffled but unmistakable. "The sheriff," Clara whispered. Taza's hand went to the knife, but she stopped him with a touch. "Don't," she said. "If they find you fighting, you'll never make it out alive. Hide yourself behind the grain sacks." "Quickly!" He obeyed without question, moving soundlessly despite his size. Clara pulled the barn door mostly shut, leaving just enough space for light. Seconds later, Sheriff Gaines's voice called out, "Miss Whitfield? You in there?" Her pulse hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, Sheriff. Just checking the horses." The door swung open. The sheriff stepped inside, raincoat dusty, eyes sharp. Two men waited outside, rifles slung at their shoulders. "Sorry to bother you," Gaines said. "We're tracking someone. Saw footprints leading this way." "Big ones," Clara swallowed. "I haven't seen anyone." The sheriff studied her face go, and for a moment she thought he saw straight through her. Then he nodded slowly. "All right then. You stay close to town, you hear? Folks say there's an Apache scout prowling around. Mean one too." He tipped his hat and left. The sound of hooves faded into the distance. Clara waited until she could no longer hear them. Only then did she turn to the shadows. "They're gone," she whispered. Taza stepped out from hiding, his expression unreadable. "You lied for me." "Yes," she said quietly. "And I'd do it again." Outside, the wind shifted, the kind of restless wind that comes before everything changes. For 3 nights after the sheriff's visit, Clara hardly slept. Every creak of the parsonage made her start. Every flicker of lantern light against the window made her heart lurch with fear that someone had found the truth she was hiding in the barn, yet the danger only made her resolve harden. Each dawn she returned to Taza, bringing food wrapped in cloth, water drawn before her father stirred. The wound on his shoulder had closed into a dark scar. He moved more easily now, silent and sure, his presence filling the small barn with a strange gravity. He had begun mending what he could, the loose boards, the broken latch, the bent horseshoe nails. Clara pretended not to notice, but she saw everything. He worked with patience and something like reverence. It was as if his hands were always building, always healing what others had broken. One morning, as she stood at the doorway, she said softly, "You could leave now, if you wanted. You're strong enough." Taza looked up from his work, the faintest glint of humor in his eyes. "And you wish me gone?" "No," she said quickly. Then more quietly, "But I know it's not safe for you here." He considered that for a moment. "It is not safe anywhere," he said. "But this place—" He glanced around the barn, the horses, the shafts of sunlight slanting through the beams. This place is peaceful. You are peaceful. She didn't know how to answer that. Peace was something she'd always been told to find in church and prayer and obedience. But now she found it in silence, in the slow rhythm of his breathing, in the sound of his knife carving a smooth handle from a block of wood, in the way he listened when she spoke. Sometimes, when the day was long and her father was occupied with his sermons, she'd bring her sewing and sit in the barn pretending to mend while they talked. He told her little about himself, not from secrecy but from the plainness of a man who had lived too much to waste words. She learned that his tribe had been scattered, that he had once had brothers, and that his people's stories were not written in books but in the land itself. In the rocks, the wind, the river, he said, everything remembers. Clara looked toward the ridge. Then this valley remembers us too, he smiled faintly. It remembers everything. Those afternoons blurred together, quiet moments strung like beads, fragile and luminous. But outside the barn the world pressed closer. At the church her father's sermons had grown sharper. There is corruption, Reverend Whitfield thundered one Sunday, creeping in from the wilderness, whispering to our young, tempting them away from righteousness. His gaze lingered on Clara longer than usual, as if he could sense the conflict stirring in her. That night, she sat by the barn door, her hands clasped tight. He speaks of sin, she said, but he doesn't see that sometimes mercy is the holiest thing there is. Taza listened. He fears what he does not understand. I used to think faith meant never doubting, she whispered. Now I'm not sure. Doubt is the place where truth begins, he said. The words settled deep in her chest. She realized then how different he was from any man she had ever known, not only in the strength of his body but in the calm of his spirit. There was something in him that made her feel seen, not as the preacher's daughter or a name whispered in pews, but as herself. When she rose to leave, the wind caught her shawl. He reached out to catch it, and his hand brushing hers. It was a small thing, a moment's touch, but it seemed to set the whole world spinning. Clara drew in a sharp breath, her heart pounding so loudly she feared he might hear it. Neither spoke. The silence between them was full, alive, not awkward, but charged with everything they couldn't say. Finally, Taza stepped back. You should go, he said gently. Someone will notice if you stay. She nodded, but her feet felt heavy as stone. At the door, she looked back once. The lantern light fell across his face, half in shadow, half in gold. He stood motionless, yet she sensed an emotion in him, the same quiet pull that she felt inside herself. That night, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the crickets sang. She thought of her father's voice, of heaven and sin and duty, and then she thought of Taza, his calm strength, his words, the way the light had caught in his eyes. For the first time in her life, she prayed not for forgiveness, but for courage. By the time the first frost crept over the valley, Clara's secret was trembling at the edge of discovery. The town of Redemption had grown uneasy. Cattle were found missing from ranches south of the ridge. Footprints, large ones, appeared in the dust after every storm. Whispers returned, louder than before. The giant of Apache Valley is back. Sheriff Gaines rode the streets more often now, his hand never far from his revolver. The men who gathered in the saloon spoke in low tones about raids and retribution. Fear is a fire that needs little spark, and in Redemption it was burning fast. Inside the parsonage, Reverend Whitfield had grown stern in a new way, measured, watchful. He studied Clara with the same scrutiny he reserved for Scripture. When she returned late from the barn or seemed distracted during supper, his brow would tighten. Clara, he said one evening, you've been restless. Is something troubling you? She forced a smile. No, Father. I've just been walking more lately. The air helps me think. You do well to keep your thoughts within the Lord's keeping, he replied. There are eyes in this town that delight in gossip, and I'd rather not have my daughter's name among their talk. She bowed her head. Yes, Father. But her thoughts were far beyond Redemption now. That same night, under the pale shimmer of moonlight, she slipped again to the barn. Taza was standing outside for the first time, wrapped in her father's old coat, his figure tall against the starlit sky. You shouldn't be out here, she whispered, glancing toward the house. He turned to her, eyes glinting in the dark. Your father already suspects, she froze. You've seen him? He came to the barn today, Taza said quietly. He did not see me, but I heard him pray. He asked his God to reveal whatever shadow lies under his roof. Clara's heart sank. Then it's only a matter of time. Taza looked toward the ridge where the mountains loomed black against the horizon. I must go tonight. You can't. I must, he said simply. The longer I stay, the greater your danger. She stepped closer. And what of you? There are men out there who would shoot you on sight. He met her gaze steadily. I've walked among worse dangers than bullets. The silence between them stretched thin, fragile. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Clara, he said finally, his voice low, almost tender. You have given me something I thought lost. Not life, I have had life before. But faith. Faith? She echoed. He nodded. Your people pray to see light. Mine listen for it in the dark. You reminded me both are the same. Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to tell him he couldn't leave, not yet. But before she could, the sound of hooves shattered the quiet. Taza's head snapped up. Riders. Lanterns flickered through the trees beyond the pasture. 3, maybe 4. Voices carried through the wind. Sheriff Gaines, Clara whispered. He must have followed me. Oh God, Taza's jaw set. Go inside now. No, she clutched his arm. If they find you, He gently pulled her hand away. You cannot stop what will happen, but you can choose your truth when it comes. Then he disappeared into the shadowed edge of the barn. Clara turned as the sheriff's voice called out. Miss Whitfield, you out here again? She forced herself to walk toward the light, her hands trembling but her chin lifted. Yes, Sheriff. The horses were restless. Gaines reined in his horse. His men spread out behind him, their eyes sharp. We saw movement down this way. Thought it might be that Apache everyone's talking about. I haven't seen anyone, she said, steady but pale. He studied her in the lamplight. You sure about that? Yes, she whispered. For a moment, neither moved. Then the sheriff sighed, tipping his hat. You're a good girl, Clara. Too good to be caught up in trouble like this. Tell your father I'll be by tomorrow to talk about safety measures. When they rode off, she nearly collapsed with relief. She turned back toward the barn and found Taza standing in the doorway again, his expression unreadable. You should not lie for me, he said. You said I could choose my truth, she answered. That was mine. He looked at her for a long time, then nodded once. So be it. The moon slipped behind a cloud and the world seemed to hold its breath. In that darkness, Clara understood. The secret could not last. One day soon, the valley itself would bear witness. And when that reckoning came, there would be no going back for her or for him. The next morning, the peace of redemption shattered. Sheriff Gaines rode hard through town before sunrise, his horse lathered, his face grim. Word spread like fire in dry grass. A rancher's wagon had been found overturned near the valley's edge, its mules gone, the driver wounded and half delirious. He claimed he'd seen the giant, a man tall as 2, with skin the color of rust and eyes like coal. That was all it took. By noon, the men of redemption were loading rifles, tying kerchiefs around their necks and forming a posse. Fear had turned to fury, and fury was easier to carry than uncertainty. Reverend Whitfield's voice rose above the noise, steady as the church bell. Brothers, he cried, the Lord commands us to protect the righteous. If evil walks again in the valley, then it is our duty to cast it out. Clara stood on the parsonage steps, her heart hammering. Every word her father spoke drove a nail deeper into her chest. She wanted to run to him, to tell him that the man he called evil had bled and healed beneath their own roof, but the words stuck in her throat. She could almost hear Taza's voice in her mind. You cannot stop what will happen. But you can choose your truth when it comes. Now it had come. When her father turned to her before mounting his horse, his expression was filled with grim purpose. Pray for us, Clara. This day we drive sin from our midst. Yes, Father, she whispered, but as soon as he was gone, she ran. The valley wind was fierce, biting her face as she climbed the ridge path. From above she could see dust rising, the posse moving fast toward the river bend where Taza had said he would go if he ever had to flee. Her breath caught. He was there, a dark figure on foot striding across the flat toward the canyon, alone against a dozen riders. Lord help me, she murmured, lifting her skirts and running faster. By the time she reached the valley floor, the first shots cracked through the air. The sound tore through her like lightning. She stumbled, then pushed on, calling out, Stop! Please stop! The men didn't hear her or didn't care. Taza had taken cover behind a fallen rock, his knife in one hand, a rifle in the other. An old weapon, scavenged, barely functional. He wasn't shooting to kill. His aim was to survive. "Hold your fire," the sheriff shouted, though his own pistol was drawn. "We'll take him alive." Reverend Whitfield rode beside him, his Bible tucked into his coat as if he could summon righteousness with lead. Clara broke into the clearing just as a bullet struck the rock near Taza's shoulder, splintering stone. "Stop!" she screamed again, running between them. The world froze. "Clara!" her father shouted, horror and disbelief mingling in his voice. "What are you doing?" "Get away from him." She spread her arms wide, standing between Taza and the posse. "You can't shoot him." "He's not your enemy." The sheriff's horse reared, startled. "For God's sake, girl, move. That man's dangerous." "He's not," she cried. "He saved no one, harmed no one, only tried to live." Her father's face was ashen. "Clara, step aside." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You preach mercy every Sunday, Father. You say no soul is beyond redemption. Will you forget your own words now?" The posse hesitated, uncertain. The wind whipped dust across the clearing, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Taza stepped forward then, his weapon lowered. His voice carried over the silence. "I am not your beast," he said, slow and even. "I fight only when hunted. If you wish my life, take it, but let her go." He looked at Clara and she shook her head violently. "No, I won't let them." Reverend Whitfield dismounted, his Bible still clutched tight. He stared at Taza, at the man his sermons had painted as legend and threat, and then at his daughter standing firm before him. For a long, breathless moment his conviction wavered. The sheriff broke the silence. "Reverend, if what she says is true," Whitfield's voice cracked like dry timber. "Then I have been blind." He lowered his head. "Men, stand down." Murmurs rippled through the group. The rifles dipped. One by one the men turned their horses away, muttering about wasted bullets and women's foolish hearts. But they obeyed. When the last echo of hoofbeats faded, Clara sagged with relief. Taza caught her before she fell. His hands were gentle, steady, the hands that had built, healed, and carried too much sorrow. Her father looked at them both, torn between love, fear, and something deeper. Finally he spoke. "I don't understand you," he said hoarsely. "Either of you. But perhaps understanding isn't what faith requires." Then he turned and walked away, leaving the Bible in the dust behind him. Clara knelt, trembling. Taza helped her to her feet, his gaze fixed on the retreating riders. "You could have been killed," he said quietly. "So could you," she answered. "But I couldn't let them destroy something I believed in." He studied her for a long moment, then said softly, "You are braver than any warrior I've known." The valley wind sighed through the canyon, scattering the dust. Above them, the church bell rang faintly from far away, its sound no longer a warning but a benediction. That night, the valley lay silent again. The air smelled of dust and smoke, of something ending, or perhaps beginning. Clara sat by the river's edge, her dress torn, her hands raw, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in her ears. Across from her, Taza crouched by the water, washing a cut along his arm where a bullet had grazed him. Neither had spoken since the posse left. The quiet between them was heavy but not painful. The kind that settles after truth has finally been told. Clara watched him, her thoughts a tangle of fear, relief, and wonder. She had defied her father, her town. Everything she'd been taught was sacred. And yet, sitting there beside him, she felt something she'd never known before. Peace. When Taza stood, moonlight spilled across his face. "You should go back," he said softly. "Your father will be waiting." She shook her head. He told them to stand down. He left his Bible behind. Taza's eyes flickered with understanding. "Then his battle is not with me anymore. It is with his own heart." Clara nodded, staring into the river. "He'll never see me the same way again." "Then he will see you truly," Taza said. "Not as a child of his sermons, but as a woman who chose her own path." She looked up at him. "And what path will you choose?" He didn't answer immediately. He lifted his gaze to the ridge where the stars stretched endless and cold above the black outline of the canyon. "My people once followed the stars to find home," he said. "But home is not the land. It is what the heart remembers." She stood and stepped closer, her breath trembling. "And what will your heart remember now?" He turned to her then, and for a long moment neither spoke. The night wrapped around them, vast and still. Somewhere an owl called, its cry fading into the distance. "I will remember," Taza said at last. "The preacher's daughter who stood between me and death, who believed in mercy when no one else would." Clara swallowed hard. "And I will remember the man they called a giant who spoke with more grace than any preacher I've known." For the first time in days, Taza smiled, a small, rare thing that seemed to change the shape of the night itself. He took something from around his neck, a small carved pendant worn smooth from years of touch. It was made from bone or stone. She couldn't tell which. "This belonged to my brother," he said. "When he died, I carried it so I would not walk alone. But now—" He hesitated, then placed it in her palm. "Now it belongs to you." Her fingers closed around it slowly. "Taza, I can't—" "You already have," he said simply. "It is not a gift. It is a promise." "A promise of what?" He looked past her toward the horizon, where the first faint glow of dawn was breaking. "That even when the world forgets, I will not." She wanted to tell him not to go, that he didn't have to vanish into the wilderness again, that redemption could learn to live up to its name. But she saw in his eyes that he had already made his choice. A man hunted for being who he was could not live among those who feared him. "Not yet," instead she said. "Then I'll wait. Not for rescue or forgiveness, but for a world that understands." Taza nodded once. "Then it will come sooner than you think." He reached out and brushed his fingers lightly against her cheek, a touch as fleeting as breath, yet it held the weight of everything unsaid. Then he turned and walked toward the canyon, his silhouette fading with the stars. Clara stood there long after he was gone, the pendant warm in her hand. When the sun finally rose, she slipped it beneath her dress, close to her heart. Behind her, the church bell tolled softly, not in warning, but in mourning, or perhaps in hope. She didn't look back. The town of redemption would wake soon, its people whispering, its men justifying, its preacher wrestling with his conscience. But for now, the valley was quiet, and in that stillness, she made her own vow. "Wherever you go," she whispered into the dawn, "you will not walk alone." The wind stirred, carrying her words toward the canyon where the light touched the rocks like fire, and for a moment Clara thought she heard an answering echo, a deep, distant voice in the heart of the land itself, promising that the story was not over. Winter came slowly to the valley, painting the ridges with frost and the trees with brittle ice. Redemption returned to its rhythm, church bells, horse hooves, and whispered prayers for safety. Yet something in the air had changed. Clara Whitfield walked through town with her chin lifted and her steps measured. People still nodded to her politely, but their eyes no longer held the same certainty. Whispers followed her, some in awe, some in judgment. But she held her head high. Her father's gaze lingered longer than usual, and she could see the weight in his shoulders. Reverend Whitfield had been forced to confront truths he could no longer ignore, that faith and mercy were not always the same as fear and obedience, and that a person's heart might teach lessons even the Bible could not. "Clara," he said one evening, voice quiet, "you have grown beyond what I imagined, beyond what I believed possible." She reached for his hand, and for the first time he did not recoil. "Father, I have learned what courage looks like, and it is not always in sermons. Sometimes it is in standing for what is right, even when no one else understands." He nodded, a faint smile breaking through his stern features. "Then the Lord has been merciful in teaching me as well." Meanwhile, far beyond the ridges, Taza moved like a shadow through the canyon and mesas, the winter wind at his back. His name had become legend among travelers and ranchers, the giant of Apache Valley, though few had actually seen him. Stories of his strength and justice spread quietly. A rider rescued, a rancher spared, a man who lived by honor, not vengeance, but for all the legend he carried Clara's promise with him, the carved pendant beneath his coat, a symbol of the bond they had formed in the valley's quiet, violent, and beautiful days. Wherever he went, he knew he would always return to the memory of the girl who had trusted him, the girl who had stood between him and death, the girl who had shown him that even in a world ruled by fear, mercy could endure. Redemption, too changed, slowly, painfully, but inevitably, the townsmen learned that fear alone could not govern them. They spoke less of the giant as a threat and more as a cautionary tale, that strength and righteousness were not the same. That courage often wore unexpected forms. Some nights, Clara would stand on the ridge looking toward the canyon, the river glinting like silver under moonlight. She would whisper to the wind, "Wherever you are not alone." And far away, she believed Taza would hear her. Years passed. The town of Redemption grew and prospered, but the valley remained wild, untouched by greed or progress. Travelers passing through told stories of a towering figure who defended the land and those who could not defend themselves. A giant who moved silently, whose eyes were as keen as an eagle's, whose heart was noble. Clara Whitfield married in the spring, her father's blessings quiet but sincere, yet she never forgot the lessons of the barn, the storm, and the giant who had changed her life forever. She kept the pendant hidden beneath her dress close to her heart, a reminder that courage and mercy could endure beyond fear, beyond legend, beyond the town itself. Even in her old age, when the ridges were gray with winter frost and the church bells echoed differently in her ears, she would look toward the valley and see a shadow among the cliffs. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps it was him, the giant who had taught her the true measure of strength. And the story lived on. The valley remembered. The river remembered. And the people of Redemption whispered of mercy, courage, and the girl who had once defied the world for what she knew to be right. The legend endured,